Welcome to Five Phenomena Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hazen. I am joined once again this week with Ted Heycraft.
Hello.
And we are conversing all of the Marvels. We are a movie podcast, but sometimes we are also a comic book podcast. All the Marvels, magnificent book by comic book critic Douglas Wolk. Douglas Wolk read 27,000 Marvel comics and gives you the pathway of the Marvel story. It's his follow-up to his other book, Rereading comics, which are two, if you're interested at all in comics, like this is, I don't know, how would you describe it? It's a great inside, outside, high art, low art way of talking about comics.
Yeah, I always have a problem, I've been the age I'm at, and I remember it was kind of a stigma to be a comic book fan and collector at one point, and to see books like this come out and articulate the joy and the artistry and the legacy, the legitimacy, and
legitimacy is a good word
of these comic books.
Because bam, pow, comics aren't for kids anymore.
Yeah, I see that. There's especially since Batman '66.
There's just a lifetime of that.
Yeah, it still happens. It still happens. That's why you'll hear me needling Doug a little bit about it, I think. But
asking about it. You and I were both really excited about this one, and there's a few episodes I've done this on. I'm glad you joined me on this one to do it, but there's a certain degree of, if you're familiar with the Chris Farley sketch on SNL, the Chris Farley show, there's definitely that little bit of degree of that with us fawning over him.
Yeah,
it's a great book. It's a great book.
The book I
cannot read it. You and I both gave reading comics to multiple people, and I have been telling everyone about all of the Marvels.
Yeah, I plan to give a few out for Christmas probably, and I read it so fast. I want to say I almost got a brain freeze out of it because it was just there. I'm going to read it again, and I'm still reading bits and pieces and going back to it. And it's one of those books. It's lovely that you can pick it up and read sections of it and put it back down.
Well, Ted, what did you watch this week?
Well, I did a big, giant theatrical catch-up run, and I got in House of Gucci and King Richard and Belfast.
We were in the same screening of House of Gucci, too.
Yes, and Spencer and Ghostbusters.
Yeah, this is the time of the year where every year as I get older, it feels more and more like a chore to go through this. Like, I have to stop what I'm watching and let's catch up with the Oscar titles and what they're being told.
And that's something I'm way behind on all the streaming stuff. But yeah, it's gonna. I think Belfast was probably the one that rises the highest of that batch I just mentioned. It's a lot of fun. A little, even as much as I enjoyed it, it almost borders on being a little bit too on the nose. A little bit,
I got the feeling it's going to stick around for a while.
Yeah,
so I may not. I may not get around to it right
away.
I think
AMC picks it up, so I think it's doubled up now. It's showplace in AMC. So,
speaking of the streaming stuff, the one movie I saw this week along those lines of Oscar stuff that was legitimately great was Tick, Tick, Boom. Lin-Manuel Miranda directed Jonathan Larson's musical, and it's written a little bit after the musical since Jonathan Larson died. But it's
so, and isn't the perception of In the Heights didn't do as well as they thought it was going to do? So this is kind of good for him, Miranda, to have this.
Yeah, I think that's correct, and I liked In the Heights too. I think everyone generally liked In the Heights.
I don't know. I understand there's some weird perception I got. Maybe I'm wrong.
No. I think there was higher expectations.
I think the pandemic had a lot to do with that.
Well, I think there was an argument that the pandemic wasn't the good reason why it didn't do as good.
Yeah.
That is for historians to decide. That is for someone to write a book all about 2021 and decide the linear through line of it. I was trying to do a metaphor, bringing it back to the book, but the Douglas Wolk book. But anyway, this is a long episode, so let's get on with the episode.
Sure.
Sure.
Avengers Assemble.
I spent the last day and a half rereading. I was catching up on reading comics. Ted and I were talking about this earlier. Like, I haven't opened it in a while, but the paper is yellowed in a specific way that almost is apropos of this conversation. And Ted said his copy has done the same thing too.
Oh yeah. I was reading. I'm getting butterflies in my stomach. This sounds so weird because I'm just so excited to be able to talk to you. Because the reading comics was just a major milestone, I thought, when it came out in many ways. And then you do this book, and you just kind of like blew my top off. It's just I want to sit here for like 5 hours and do a 5-hour confab with you about certain things, but I know we got to keep it in control here.
We just did an episode on Alan Moore 2 back, and I was having trouble gathering my thoughts at the beginning, and reading comics, I realized I was just using big chunks of your thesis.
Well, thank you.
So, yeah, with the all the Marvels, I read it so fast when it came out. I think I developed a brain freeze, and I've forgotten so much now. I need to read. Of course, I plan to reread it again, and probably going to be a lot of Christmas gifts this Christmas for a lot of my friends.
Nice.
So I kind of want to start out by asking all three of us, but mainly you, Douglas. What was your first comic?
It was my first comic. I got a lot of Richie Rich and Casper and stuff comics when I was small, but the first one that I really, really glommed onto was probably an issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow. And that would have been in the summer of 1978. I just got the one. And then a year later, I went back to the same newsstand because I was, upstate New York visiting my grandparents. And I got another one. And I needed to know what happened next. And so a month later, I found another newsstand when I'd gone back to Michigan. And they had the next issue. And then there was another comic that had Green Lantern in it too. And then there was another thing that looked good, so I picked that up too. And then the next week I went back. And then a few weeks later, I learned that there was a store that sold nothing but comics that was down the street. And it was all downhill from there.
I mean, that's mine. I was at camp. I was at a Walmart, but
mine's a little bit messier, probably. I think is not that messy, but I had an uncle that's 5 years older than me.
Okay.
And one thing I wanted to tell you, Douglas, I'm 63 years old, so I was there when Kirby was still drawing Marvels when I was buying Marvels. Ditko had just left, but I'm part of that generation that was just in that last buzz of the before Jack jumped ship to go to DC in 1970. So my uncle had a whole handful of Marvels. I think he bought at the PX in London. I had a Sergeant Fury #7, an FF Annual 2. So I was just I was enamored. I think I was convinced that the really good comics were the ones in the little box in the corner. I was telling everybody in the neighborhood, these are the ones you should buy. And so I started buying. I think one of the first things I ever bought was the second Romita Senior Spider-Man. That was probably the first thing I bought with my own change left over from getting my haircut at the local drugstore. But what's funny is I'm glad you pointed out in your book the Marvel's the Mike's Amazing Cover Gallery website, because you can do that newsstand thing.
Yeah.
And I figured out that I started buying on my own volition in the summer of '66.
Nice.
And it's so funny. There's like 2 or 3 DCs that summer, and then there's no DCs till 1970. Everything else is Marvel. Because I followed Jack over to DC, and then I discovered Neil Adams too, because the Green Lantern, Green Arrow started in 1970. So that's kind of a little bit of my history there.
Well, Douglas, what is your first Marvel comic then?
My first Marvel comic. So that's a little bit trickier, because the kid across the street from me, Andy Wolf, had Marvels and I had DCs, and so he would read my Green Lanterns and Batmans and Flashes, and he had Daredevil and Moon Knight, and they were weird and creepy, and I liked them, and I didn't know what to make of them. And I think the first one I actually bought myself was X-Men 138.
Okay, that's okay. An interesting issue to
which is the one that's literally just summarizing the plot of everything up to that point.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I have that issue somewhere. I'm in a similar vein where my first run was DC. It was I started right when William Messenger Loebs was writing Flash at the very tail end of it. But my first run I really glommed onto was Mark Waid's Flash. But Marvel wise, Service Merchandise, the catalog used to give out I think it was like 11 copies of what came out a certain month. And I did that for two. I asked for that for 2 Christmases in a row. So it was like a I'm hearing you guys. We all three of us, I think, are
10 years apart, and I think we're about almost 10 years, or a decade apart, are at a ground zero.
Part of all the Marvels, the biggest chapter is your X-Men chapter, and it's clear your devotion to Claremont Byrne, but also just the X-Men run. My first Marvel comic would have been probably one of Claremont's last Uncanny X-Men.
And then we're both. You were working in a comic book shop in the mid '80s. I was working at our comic shop, and I was in charge of ordering the stuff. I would, and we actually would, because of when Watchmen and Dark Knight started coming out, we were so excited. We would actually get my own little Honda Civic and drive to the Glenwood in Illinois and pick up the boxes themselves and bring them back so we could get to them earlier. Get to them right away.
Well, so when did you start working at a comic book store?
So I started hanging out at the comic book store all the time in 1980, and I think it was in 83 that they were like, okay, we're just going to teach you to use the register.
Isn't that a common thing between?
Same here.
It's they're like, all right, you're the kid who's here it's fine. We'll hire you.
How long did you end up working?
So I worked there until I went to college in 87. And then I would come back on winter breaks, and they would be like, great, you're back. You got to fill in. And I came back for a few months after I got out of college and was working there again. And I was like, okay, you know what? Love this place. I have to get out of here. But the store is still there. It is no longer a comic store. It was a used bookstore to begin with, and it's still a used bookstore. But it's still there. Curious Bookshop in East Lansing, Michigan. Run by the same guy who's been running it for 50 plus years.
But he dropped the comics, huh?
He dropped the comics. So the comics were upstairs for a long time, and then they were around the corner in kind of a separate annex. And then that closed when everything imploded in the early 90s. But he's still a used bookstore, and his employees are unbelievably loyal to him. He could not pay us very well, but he treated us incredibly well. And so his staff has all been there for 20, 30 years.
Yeah, we had a similar boss. He just passed away.
I'm just seeing a lot of parallels here.
Yeah, the Book Broker is the longest running store in Evansville, Indiana, where we're from. And I started hanging around there. When he opened, I saw an article in the paper about this new little used bookstore. It was a little shack. And I got in the car and went straight there. And
you would have been late 70s, though, right?
16, 17 years old in the 70s. It's mid-70s. And the comic book stores were just starting to populate the country.
So to square this entire circle, you were talking about Bill Messner-Loeb's run on The Flash.
Yeah.
So I teach comics history at Portland State, and a few weeks ago we were talking about Bill Messner-Loeb's Journey. Mm-hmm. And I absolutely love that series. Diana Schutz used to teach the class, and this term she was taking the class from me, which is kind of intimidating. She's amazing. She's been.
This is the same
everything.
Bendis teaching at a similar.
Yeah.
Same, okay.
I guess she needed the credit because she knows, she would know it inside and out.
She was auditing the class just as senior auditor, and not only do you know all this stuff, you lived all this stuff.
Yeah.
What were you teaching her that she didn't know? Was she wanting to fill in her William Messenger-Loeb's gaps?
I have no. She would know that. She would definitely
mentioned William Messenger-Loeb's, and I said and that he did this for a few years, and then he went on to write The Flash and Wonder Woman for DC, and I think he wrote Johnny Quest first. He was and she said, actually, I hired him to write Johnny Quest for Comico. Yes, of course he did. Okay, thank you.
Wow.
When did you first start getting some freelance pieces or some press for comics? When did you start writing comic stuff?
So start writing comic stuff. In 1993, I started working for a music magazine. I was a managing editor at CMJ New Music Monthly. Okay. And they needed to fill pages because they had no freelance budget. And they're well, let's do a couple pages every month about other media. I was okay, great. And I started, I wrote a piece about Doom Patrol, the Grant Morrison Doom Patrol. And that led to a couple of other places saying hey, do you want to write about some comics for us? Which, great. and I still made most of my living writing about music until 6 or 7 years ago, and then gradually shifted over to a little bit of stuff about music and a whole lot of stuff about comics.
Okay, I was rereading your blog, and I was seeing how much of it was music based. And your first book is the 33 the half series,
the James Brown book,
yeah, Live at the Apollo. I haven't read that, but I have similar feelings that Ted does on reading comics, where I thought it was a distillation of. I think you're one of our finest comic critics. I really was been reading comics criticism, trying to find what to get into for the longest time, and you describe it so well in Reading Comics, how the fight between mainstream and art comics. And I remember it was at one point early in the book, you have the section on why I hate my culture, and you talked about certain things in comic stuff that, and I was like, yeah. And part of it was like, okay, this is in the back of my head. I didn't realize it until I came to the 2 sections later, how I've read certain things like that before. But then you said why I love my culture, and I started realizing half the reason I read comics is to talk to other people about comics. And it was such a great take on it too, just because half of the divide between the mainstream and the art debate is the mainstream gets us in, and then we turn around and like, oh, we need to grow up and read more deeper stuff and get to the art, and then, but it still means so much. Both mean so much to us.
Oh, there's so much I want to unravel there, but because when I read Reading Comics, I thought, okay, you're over here in the Comics Journal, Gary Groth, art side, and all the wonderful stuff that's coming out and happening. And I like this quote that Michael Urey, I read it in Back Issue magazine recently, where he goes, "We grew up with comics, but also comic books grew up with us." And we got to see that happen in front of our eyes. And now we have all this wonderful stuff that you don't have to read guys in their underwear beating each other up. But the allure of those Marvels and those DCs and stuff is still so potent and so strong. I was shocked when you came out, you were announcing this book that you were going to do this, because I guess I thought you were pretty much planted your foot in the art or the independent or alternative field. So where do you stand on that? Where do you? I mean, are you still a strong mainstream reader as much as a alternative reader, or what?
I'm kind of both. And the last 2 years when I was working on this book, I was just like all Marvel all the time, and that was a little hard to take. But like I read everything. I went to Silver Sprocket, the store, last month in San Francisco, and I was just like, I need everything in this store right now. But also, like I'll bring home a stack of like 10 Marvel DC Image books every week. I read all that. I read it all. There are so many things that I like so much. Like, and of course, like the punchline is that if I had to pick one giant body of comics work that would be like my favorite, it'd probably be Judge Dredd.
Because you've written Judge Dredd comics before.
Which is just like, that's like, well, that's a third option.
Yeah, I didn't see that coming. Wow. Did you? So do you have any kind of sense of, as you get older? I need to read James Joyce's Ulysses. Why am I reading these comic books and stuff?
Because one of the things I get from it is that you seem well read all across the board, not just in comics.
Used to be a little more than I am. Like after I finished the book, I was like, it's time to go back to the pile of prose books that have been piling up with lots of little words and no pictures.
So, okay.
Yeah. But look, the pandemic has destroyed my attention span. Damn. Okay.
I think one of the things that came from reading comics that I liked were that kind of, in a good way, aggrandized mainstream readers. Was one concept that I was reciting to everyone was your concept of super readers, the ones that can remember continuity from 30 years back, which I think really leads us into all of the Marvels.
Yeah, and why do you, with all the Marvels, it makes me think about, I have some kind of like thesis bubbling in my head. I always bounce this off Shane and my other fellow comic book fans, that there's a certain generation of us, and I think you might squeeze in. I'm not sure. I know Shane's too young for it, but it's that we were there in that first flush of Marvel, and that excitement, that buzz, and the things percolating. And Batman '66 was out, even though that's divisive with some people, and blah blah blah. That we just can't let go of it. It's like in our DNA, because there was no cable, there was no VHS, there was no Laserdisc, there was no video games. You had 3 channels. And if your dad wanted to watch a Dean Martin variety show, then you didn't get to watch a Green Lantern or Green Hornet, or Bat. It was, so we read these comic books to death. We read them over and over, and the excitement of what Stan, Jack, and Steve,
they were yours.
We were doing it. That you could control it, read it at your leisure, over and go, and then you trade with other kids. There's no comic book stores either. So I think there's something about this lock we have on this generation has a lock on it. I wonder what's going to happen when this generation, finally, the last tail end of the baby boomers pass away. Will that change the whole face or makeup of what we see in terms of mainstream comics? Because this superhero lock is kind of ridiculous in a weird way, but part of it is that we just can't let it go. Seems like.
I mean,
does that make
the
sense?
mainstream now, in terms of like what people buy and buy and buy, is Raina Telgemeier. It's Dav Pilkey. Like, those are getting sales now that Karl Barks and Ditko and Kirby in the 60s could only have dreamed of.
Right.
Are you talking about stuff like the YA market or stuff that's being put into bookstores? Okay.
Yeah, totally. Like, those books sell like crazy. That is a mainstream of comics now. It's not the only mainstream, but it is like something that there is a generation that has now glommed onto. And that's kind of amazing.
Oh, well, I mean, what do you make of that, I guess, going forward? It's hard to predict what another generation is going to...
Because we keep on thinking they're going to die out. At some point, something's going to have to happen. But they still hang in there. They're still hanging in there, the mainstream stuff.
Yeah, and, the superhero comics, they're not going away. Or, they've been dying since 1938. But
right.
Every time I hear, like, oh, it's done, it's going to be gone in 6 months, gone, distribution, like, there's all kinds of economic and distribution and zillion problems with it, and yet they hold on and they keep selling a little bit more every year. They're like Funyuns, they don't need anybody to hyper promote them. They just kind of keep on going miraculously.
There is that part in all the Marvels where you talk about how you think today's comics are going to read, but you're curiously hoping that the comics in the 2040s are going to be just as you hope they'll be just as relevant. Let's get to the premise of the book. So basically, you read over 27,000 issues of Marvel comics, ostensibly from you go a little before Fantastic Four #1, all the way up to about 2016, although you go well past 2016. You point out at one point over 540,000 pages of Marvel comics.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a friend... I don't want to phrase. I want to phrase this in a way that doesn't get you in trouble, but or us in trouble. But back in the aughts, when we first heard this concept of reading the entire Marvel linearity from a torrent that went up, that promised to have, like, I don't remember how many gigs it was, but it promised to have all the Marvel stuff. And I think even at one point you used the phrase of how you got all that really long that section where you explain how long you've been reading these. You do use the phrase "sketchy province." So, but. Are you familiar with this torrent, or where did you first think of, like, I should go through everything?
Okay, well, I mean, because it was your son's idea, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Like, it was my son's idea, like, I want to read all. Yeah. Okay, kid, you'll read all of it. And then we read a bunch together, and I was like, I wonder what would happen if I did read all of it. And like I say, it was genuinely not hard to track down everything. The stuff that was hard to find was, a lot of, like, custom comics and things like that. But I have a lot of friends who have things or have access to things like that. Tracking stuff down was not the hard part. Like, just making it through all of it without turning into the flaming carrot was the hard part.
Were you rereading everything, or were you, like, sometimes being like, I read this run, I don't need another read at this run?
Yeah, I mean, I thought at first, like, okay, like, If I read it and I remember it really, really, really well, I don't need to read it again.
Wow.
And then I thought, if I remember it and I remember it really, 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 I probably want to read it again.
Fair enough.
Yeah, okay. And I kept going back things and going like, oh yeah, this has changed since I read it before, or I've changed, or yeah, okay.
Well, your Sal Buscema story, like how Sal, you probably originally thought Sal wasn't that great an artist, but then when you go back, now you're looking at him in a different light, a whole different light, which that happens with me with all kind of artists. I used to think Sikowski on Justice League was the weirdest, wonkiest thing I'd ever seen, and didn't like it at all. Now I love it. It's got such a quirkiness to it.
Totally.
Did you? Your son said he got done with the '60s. You jumped ahead to a few the current
Civil War, basically.
Civil War, right? So, had you started the book at this point, at the idea, or were you just doing this with your son?
No, at that point I was just doing it with my son. I was not even reading everything with him. I was like reading some stuff with him, and then he was reading some stuff on his own.
Oh.
But I started thinking like I really want to do like a big comics writing project about some big body of work, and have a big project I can throw myself into that'll maybe take like as much as 2 years or even 2.5 years to like do all the reading and do all the writing. Yeah, I can do that. I thought like, yeah, this'll maybe take 2.5 years. 6 years later, here we are.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so that fits that number. I was going to ask you. You mentioned the number 6 years ago is when you kind of mainly started pushing on to comics. Was there any comic-related project in between this and reading comics? Or 6 years to devote to this makes sense, I guess.
There were a lot of magazine articles. I was doing graphic novel reviews for the New York Times Book Review for a long time. There was the Judge Dredd book that I wrote, which was like just about the most fun thing I've ever gotten to do.
Really? I mean, I got a blind spot. I'm going to have to go out and order that tonight when I get off. When we leave here, I didn't even know you did that.
It was such a blast to do, and I got to work with this artist Ulysses Farinas, who is brilliant, and like I'd always wanted to be able to collaborate on a comic with someone, and it was super, super, super collaborative. Like he and I were texting each other 7 or 8 times a day.
I was just going to go. One of the central premises of the book is that the Marvel saga is possibly the longest saga in human history. You have the quote in here of Marcel Proust times Doris Lessing times Robert Altman to the power of the Mahābhārata, which you say is 13,000 page volumes. Which you also have the footnote in there is technically the Incredible Hulk is longer than that.
I mean, the Incredible Hulk has fewer words, and more of them are smash.
More smash.
In terms of scope, I think I'm probably right about that. There are certain soap operas that have been running since the 1930s or 1940s in one form or another.
Okay.
But it seems different somehow, in part because like how are you going to judge bigness for a visual medium or audio medium, because some of those soap operas started as radio shows, and also because there's not the kind of institutional memory about it. Like somebody who is watching Days of Our Lives or Search for Tomorrow in the present or recent decades when Search for Tomorrow was still going on could not have been necessarily expected to like have a sense of like what important things happened on the show 40 years earlier.
They're not streaming earlier audio only versions of this.
Yeah, and like you can track down like DVD sets of old General Hospital episodes, but it's not the same as like you have this library and there's this sense of the big picture.
So the big reason DC just because it seems like they started getting more into continuity following Marvel, or is it a thing of like, does the reboots count too? Just because Marvel has never really completely...
Marvel's never rebooted, and DC has 2 or 3 times said like, yeah, everything up to this point, not so much.
Even if we're bringing it back in later, retroactively.
If I can interject here, that's another thing about, I was, like I told you, I didn't stick with DCs for a little bit till I got older. But I thought DC was cool. The one thing they had that was cool was they had Earth 1 and they had Earth 2. And I would tell my dad, I go, Dad, the comic books you read, because my dad said he read comic books, you read those were on Earth 2. The ones I'm reading now are Earth 1. So I thought that was a really cool concept. And what do they do in 1985? They decided it's too complicated. And I thought that was And it's a great story, and God bless George Perez, who we got such a sad news.
That's
It's a great story. I love reading that Crisis story, but it was such a mistake in such a way that now they just both companies have given up and said, hey, everything's a multiverse now. I didn't even know, and I'm so happy that you explained where Earth 616 came from, because I wasn't reading those issues where all of a sudden, like, why is everybody referencing this as Earth 616?
I thought it was an Alan Moore thing,
and
the Captain Britain stuff.
So it's almost an Alan Moore thing.
Okay.
Alan Moore was the first person to use the number on the page, but he's not the person who came up with the idea.
Okay.
It was the previous writer, Dave Thorpe, who was like, okay, this is Earth 616.
Okay.
Where was Alan Moore referencing Marvel in
Captain Britain?
Oh, Captain Britain. Oh, yeah, that's right. Captain Britain. Sorry. So I think it's one of the travesties. We're never gonna ever see the Fantastic Four written by Alan Moore. That's what he wanted to do first when he came over here. And I thought I would love to see that happen, but it's not going to.
Speaking of Fantastic Four, I thought one of the big insights you had was trying to figure out exactly why Marvel took off, the particular genre hybrid. You talk about how, well, first off, you have this great quote at the beginning where it's Marvel it's high adventure, slapstick comedy, soap opera, blood-spattered horror, tender character study, and political allegory all in the same week. And it's adventure serial comic that's also a superhero comic, and also a monster comic, and also a romance comic, and also a teen horror comic, and also a sci-fi comic all at once, but not a crime comic.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to see like what is so immediately special about Fantastic Four at the beginning from where I am, being really used to it. But I've read some things by people who picked up those early issues and it blew their minds. John Byrne has written about it. Fred Hembeck has written about it. And just like seeing these things and being like, never seen anything like this before. And trying to kind of retro-engineer that feeling. Like, what's so amazing about this? What is so special about this? Like, even reading it now, when I was reading it with my kid, the early stuff, he was like, okay, yeah, this is kind of fun. And by a couple dozen issues in, he was like, okay, this has gotten really good now. Yeah.
My point was that with the MCU's popularity, or taking stuff like even South Korea's influence on current cinema, like genre hybrid is the future of at least movies, and MCU's popularity seems to be. I just thought it was a keen insight.
Well, no, I think it's perfect insight. I thought when I read that, I have read John Byrne and Hembeck, some of those things, but when you said that romance, you listed it off. I'm like, that's the magic, and that's probably what. I remember it was so funny. You retroactively look back now and see DC trying to get hip. With Carmen was trying, they were Anthro and Bamba and Brana Beast and the Secret Six. They were trying so desperately to try to be hip, and they just couldn't nail it. It took a while before they got it down. When Denny and some other people started, getting into gear. But man, it was just something. So Stan, Jack, and Steve just somehow hit that hybrid notion of and I think that's what's so exciting about your book is that you actually see it articulated and trying to figure out why are these comic books so magical.
There's actually there's an alternate version of the Linda Carter chapter that I ended up printing up as a little chapbook, and it got sent out to people who pre-ordered the book from my favorite comic book store, Books with Pictures. And the alternate version is just a completely fictional history of Marvel in the 60s and early 70s, which is just imagining if the kind of aesthetic and commercial breakthrough comic had been Linda Carter's Student Nurse rather than Fantastic Four, and if Marvel had thrown all of their resources into doing these crazy hybrid comics that are at their core comics about young professional women and teenage girls. So Amazing Adult Fantasy changes its name to Amazing Adults, and Betty of the Bugle is in there, and she spins off into her own series, and all that.
Have you ever read? There's an essay by Michael Chabon I'm really fond of, where he writes the alternative history of American prose. If it does, I think it's the Nurse novel or something like that.
Oh, wow.
It's in one of the McSweeney's anthologies. I think it's the Nurse novel, but he talks about what Thomas Pynchon and Philip Ross Nurse novels would be like.
That sounds amazing, and I have to find it.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up too, because I bet you there's a chance that could have happened. Maybe if Martin just wanted to be a copycat and flood the market with what was they had something right in front of their eyes and they didn't even see it probably, and then he heard the Justice League that was selling and give me a team book, so therefore the Linda Carter aspect.
Douglas, have you read the Abraham Reisman biography of Stan Lee?
Stan Lee bio, yeah.
Yeah, that was another reason, just because Ted and I have had a lot of conversations on it. He and I have differing and I love how in the book you just kind of like, the debate's there, let's get past it. But I found the biography had a really interesting idea of Stan's talent being caption writing, and going back to this synthesis of what it was. I still found you have found a generous way of like pointing out everyone's contribution. That's why I was curious, like in your observation of why Marvel took off more than anybody else.
Well, I think Jack Kirby's fingerprints are so strong on everything. I think even I hate this. I might be tarred and feathered for saying this, but even Doctor Strange is really a reworking of Doctor Doom in some ways, and Kirby did worked in the original Doctor Doom, and then Kirby was supposed to do a Spider-Man, but Stan Lee didn't like his Spider-Man, but he ended up doing the cover, and then he actually contributed to some Daredevil 1, on the cover and stuff. So it's almost like Jack is just whatever his career had been building up to, something happened and he just exploded.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that Kirby's fingerprints are everywhere, but I think you also have to acknowledge that Lee's fingerprints are everywhere more than anything else as an editor, as the person who says yeah, that idea, or not so much of that. And you get to see these people who have been working in comics for decades already suddenly turn into something much more than they had been.
I mean, the other thing I really love about the book is also that you talk about it being like one of the grandest collaborations, considering it's a sustained thing, and just the and how much it's not planned. It doesn't technically have a beginning. It's never going to have an ending. It's all being improvised as it goes along. You have that one point whenever you use the typical fan complaints about this character wouldn't say that, and you're like, well, they just did because it's in a Marvel canon comic. I wanted to get to the Spider-Man chapter. This is a recurring theme for this conversation. I know we're just talking at you right now, quoting you from the book, but it's just like you distill so much of synthesize so much of what makes these things work, but in it and also from a distance. Anyway, I wanted you to go through the cycles of Spider-Man. You had was it 4 cycles total in the book?
I think we're up to 6 now, something like that.
Okay. The first one goes to Gwen Stacy's death. Yeah.
So the pattern is Peter Parker starts at the bottom, and has to he starts out being alienated from what he could be. He's a kid who's lost his parents 1.5 times already. Second time, his second father dies and he's pretty sure it's his fault. And how is this messed up, terrified kid going to become an adult is the premise of Spider-Man for its early years. And you see him gradually take on this other identity to try to make his way into the world. And there's a point in the middle of it where, Spider-Man no more. He's throwing the costume in the trash, throwing this alternate identity in the trash, and then he realizes no, that's not what's keeping me from being able to grow up. It's what's allowing me to be able to grow up. He goes and reclaims it. And then there's a point that is kind of a happy ending, which is right before Stan Lee hops off. I
remember in particular you pointed out Spider-Man was going for prison reform at that moment.
Yeah. He's talking about prison reform. He's on TV. He's suddenly got a salary job at the Bugle. He's thinking about maybe proposing to Gwen. He's got it together. And then the next issue is supposed to be called The Summing Up. And it's actually the one where he wakes up and he's got 6 arms, and then Stan goes off and whatever. But then that all falls apart. Norman Osborn kills Gwen. Norman Osborn dies himself. Bam, he's knocked all the way back down. And he has to start the second cycle. And the second cycle starts with him fighting all the same people he fought at the beginning. All the sort of like surrogate father characters, all of the older male scientists and pro wrestler types.
Your
and, like,
father figure observation was one of the ones I liked a lot. Him constantly going for father figures and
and like the two biggest father figures are like Dr. Octopus, who right near the beginning like nearly marries Aunt May. Like, could you put any more of a bow on it? And Norman Osborn, who is the like rich, successful father who turns out to be like an absolutely terrible father who's like cursed his son to be like him, and builds his way slowly back up again. There's another crisis on campus. There's the moment of abandoning the other self is the clone story, where he like takes the other version of himself who has died and throws him down into a trash chute, a smokestack. Like, none of this can have been intentional. None of this can have been what Jerry Conway had in mind or what Stan Lee had in mind. Mm-hmm. And yet, it just sort of assumes this form. And this goes on until the point where he gets his like classical comedy happy ending and marries Mary Jane. And that is the false happy ending. Immediately after they get married, the next month, we get Craven's Last Hunt, where the other kind of father figure, the sort of like showman type, the pro wrestler type, kills him, sticks him in the ground, takes over his life, and then kills himself. And Peter has to literally dig his way out of his own grave to start the next cycle. And actually, immediately after that, there's the that 3-part story that Ann Nesenti wrote, where like he loses his mind, and like so like you destroy the body and then start that over again. You destroy the mind, he has to build himself up from that, and you start again. And where that one feels like it's supposed to end is the big clone story in the mid-90s. Which is where we were supposed to find out that like the other self that he abandoned has come back, and and Ben Reilly was supposed to like take over being Spider-Man, so Peter Parker could retire since Aunt May has now died. So sad, we'll never see her again. And Mary Jane is pregnant, and they're going to go off to Portland, Oregon, where I live, and settle down. And that was the plan. And then everyone was like, "You can't do that."
So we're getting to the period of Spider-Man where that was my big period, and it's so much 90s comics in general are misbegotten that whenever I talk to someone like Ted, I can't defend any of this stuff, and it's not necessarily I read it and it's ingrained in my memory, but it may not be flawed to me. But that's where like your doppelganger interpretation really made sense too. But you thought the Riley saga would have made a interesting if they follow through with it, it would have been good too, or at least in the broad sense.
I mean, it dramatically completes the story. It lets somebody else take over and like right now, Ben Reilly is also being Spider-Man again.
Yeah,
like there's something to that idea, but also like there was the sense of like, you mean the story we've been following for the last 20 years is not the real Spider-Man? Cracks knuckles.
Yeah, did you ever find the origin of the Stanley quote, "The illusion of change," that I know Bendis uses a lot? Like,
never found a source for it.
Okay,
I cannot trace it back to a specific thing that Stanley has been quoted as saying. I think the earliest one I found is like Steve Englehart mentioning it in an interview like 6 years later.
Okay,
so.
Yeah. Brand New Day and One More Day was where I stopped reading Spider-Man for years because for that exact reason. Whereas like my entire reading of Spider-Man and responsibility involved marriage. So
yeah.
I mean, I never read a lot of the romance stories stuff in it. So like, and part of it was so how cheaply they like all of reality's erased except everything else. I just like I can't. It was years before I was able to get back into Spider-Man after that. I wanted to throw one interpretation at you I just read the other day. So James Cameron has this coffee table book coming out of his art, and there's some stuff in there about his Spider-Man apparently. and he was giving an interview about it. And he gives the usual stuff. And, I'm sure you've heard this, that a lot of his version was going to deal with Spider-Man and puberty, where like the web shooters were
Right.
a big metaphor.
Right.
But he has this quote in there where gets the movie stuff really well, where he says Spider-Man's a great metaphor for that untapped reservoir of potential that people have that they don't recognize themselves.
Yeah, I can hear that. I mean, that is the lifting the big heavy thing, right? I have a whole rant about like Spider-Man, the big heavy thing, but that's
how many times they've done that. And
well, specifically how it's turned into this symbol of like, yeah, we know what we're talking about. We are talking about the same Spider-Man here. Like there are quick little allusions to it in like Homecoming. There's a quick little allusion to it in the Marvel Spider-Man like video game from a couple years ago. And in the movie, he's like, "Come on, Spider-Man! Come on, Spider-Man!"
There's the one in Civil War, the movie too.
Yeah, I mean, it's always just like a quick moment, but it's like, yeah, we know what we're doing here.
Ted has the same rant, actually. It's so funny you're saying this.
Yeah, but it's also become like shorthand for the moment everybody knows, which is interesting. Like the number of times we've seen parodies of it in the last 5 or 10 years is just remarkable.
Do you have any, I mean, not just to completely go on, but like, I've read some of those old issues, but it's been so long I can't remember. And I don't remember going all the way through the Ditko run. I really first was like told this is a sequence to pay attention to from your work. Do you have a sense of the legacy of something like reading comics where people came up to you afterwards and like, oh, this is something we should pay attention to just because is it? I mean,
wow. Like that sequence specifically, I had seen called out a bunch of times before then.
Okay.
Gil Kane talked in a few different interviews about how like this was a formative thing for him. He actually did versions of it in a couple of DC comics in the 80s. There's one with Captain Marvel and there's one with somebody else. And the first homage to it that Marvel does is actually in a Hulk story in the Hulk magazine in 1980. And then there's one in one of Walt Simonson's Thor stories. The scene where the frog is lifting the hammer is beat for beat that scene.
It's been a while since I read that one. But,
within my body, like he says, within my body is the strength of many frogs.
You and Ted have been helpful to me to like pay more attention to. I remember you talked about the flexibility of Ditko, and I try to pay attention to that. But like Ditko for me is Rorschach, like it's rough.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up the Master of Kung Fu chapter because that is the one chapter I have read nothing of, and I just wanted you two to go at it.
Oh well, gosh, but I was scared that we would never get to see a nice reprint of it because of the licensing to the Romer estate. And all of a sudden they put. I think I don't think they're going to keep that license up. So I think the reprints are going to probably shoot up in collectors' prices because
it doesn't have to be licensed anymore.
You think so? The Romer?
Now.
I don't think they're going to use Fu Manchu anymore, though. They're not. Yeah.
Well, no.
But they're not using Nayland Smith or Dr. Petrie and all those characters. Yeah. I thought there was still some copyright on that. You think it's that old? The estate on that?
I am not a lawyer.
We all figured that was the holdup because they didn't want to put out the extra bucks. I think the omnibuses have a copyright reference to the Romer estate. I don't know. Okay. I'll have to double check that. But we were so happy to see that because a friend of mine, a friend has this little game he plays. He's like, what if the house is on fire? What comic books would you grab and run out of it? And of course, it's probably number one is Manhunter, like Simonson and Goodwin Simonson. But the Mensch Galassi Kung Fu's are right there, baby. Wow. I don't know if when you read these now, did you reread them again for the book?
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
I always thought it was weird because the early run of Galassi, you could see him working things out, and then he disappears for a few issues. Even though I think he was over actually in Deadly Hands, the magazine. But there was like a few issues, and I had dropped out. I said, well, this is kind of meandering, and it's not, and they can't figure out who the artist is, and I gave up on it. So I'm at my grandparents in Lexington, Kentucky. We're gonna go to the drugstore, and I see this another Gil Kane cover, because Gil Kane was everywhere on Marvel. So I pull it up, and that's and also that Razor Fist story where Gacy comes back, and also they're doing James Bond movies with the splash pages, and I thought he's gone to the crossroads, because his artwork just took a leap forward. I thought, I don't know if did that feel that way to you? There was like a shift in his art.
It definitely ramps up in a hurry. I don't know if he was away from it at all. I think he drew a couple of issues.
The giant size too, right?
But like it's kind of like he's kind of there from the beginning. It's just the learning curve that anybody has. But by the time he's gotten about a dozen issues in, suddenly he's just astonishing. And like my favorite period of that series is probably the Jean Day period.
Right. Oh, it's just as interesting as the other one, the Zach period and the Gacy period. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just beautiful, beautiful stuff. And like I said, I thought when I started writing about it, like it was long enough ago, that was like I started the chapter with like, there's never going to be a Master Kung Fu movie. There's never going to be a Master Kung Fu video game. A couple months ago, I bought it Shang-Chi Little.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah, and it like Blackjack Tar and Leica Wu are in it. Like it's
I know
it's a whole thing.
I couldn't believe that. That was amazing. But and they kept the father-son dynamics in the movie. Even though it's not the Shang-Chi that I kind of remember, it's still got the whole the subtextual thematic elements is there. So it's been because I thought, well, if they're going to do a martial, they actually did on the TV, but the Iron Fist is the one it seems like a natural, because he's more superhero-ish, I guess. But I was amazed too that they actually came through with Shang-Chi.
Who was the artist that was at the end that died just shortly after the run-in?
Jean Day.
Yeah, there's some kind of interesting controversy they were trying to stir up about that too at the time.
Well, Douglas, you say that you thought he would have been one of the majors if he had survived.
Oh yeah, I mean he was one of the majors. He just on the basis of if you look at his issues of Master of Kung Fu, like I showed a couple of them to my students, and they were like, how have I never heard of this guy?
I mean, reading that chapter, there's a lot of instances in the book where you're just like, shit, I got another run to read. But that was a big one. A lot of my gateway in the last few years is Bendis, which I've mentioned like multiple times. And you write more about Daredevil and reading comics than you do. You mentioned it quite a few times in all the Marvels, but did you ever think about doing a Daredevil chapter?
So my friend Stephanie Burt, who was one of my close readers on this book, kept pushing me like, why isn't there a Daredevil chapter? There ought to be a Daredevil chapter. And I never did write the Daredevil chapter. Partly it's because I don't have a coherent argument about Daredevil.
Okay.
Partly because like there's a bunch of different runs of Daredevil that I like a whole lot, and they're practically different comics. Like, I love the Frank Miller stuff. I really love the Ann Nesenti, John Romita Jr., Al Williamson stuff. Like, those issues are gorgeous and they're weird and there's still nothing else like them. I really like the Bendis stuff, and it also seemed like anything that I could say about them would just kind of overlap with stuff that was already in the book. There's a lot of stuff that I wrote for this that ended up getting cut.
Okay.
There are a bunch of chapters that were just like, this is okay, but I already have another thing that does this better that's in here, so out it goes.
Is there a lot cut or what?
Yeah. Okay. So I basically ended up writing this book twice.
That's good writing.
Wrote the first time and finished it, and then it was terrible.
Oh.
It was not good. It was boring. It was exhausting to get through. It was me talking to the inside of my head. And I started over. I threw out like 85% of what was there and threw out a bunch of chapters, added a bunch of things, changed a bunch of things around, and took a real different tack. So there's a lot of stuff in that version that was just like, this has too much of what was here before. It's going to go somewhere else.
Okay.
So,
I always used to sell Daredevil when the series was coming out to my friends, as I thought it was the most consistently best written character. Yeah. But I mean, maybe that's all post Frank Miller. So I mean, and like I said, you do write a lot about the ghost of Frank Miller on Daredevil stuff in Reading Comics. But Do we want to get to the X-Men chapter? I think it's the biggest chapter in the book.
Sure. So hilariously, the first version of the book, the X-Men chapter was like 3 pages.
Did you just deliberately try to get through it quickly?
I just punted.
Okay.
It was, and
there's a lot of. That's one of the Marvel characters. There's a lot of like. You mentioned a book that's distillation on the Phoenix alone that I had never heard of. Like, there's so much written about the X-Men in general, just because it's such a loaded metaphor.
Oh, the Ramsey Fawaz book, The New Mutants. Yeah.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is that. I mean, X-Men was my thing growing up, just because I was in the crappy '90s, and like Jim Lee to this day still probably one of my top 5 artists. There's something about him that he's gotten better over the years, especially as he's gotten to his watercolor phase. He's a great Instagram follow. Yeah. But you talk about the run. So you both were working during the height of.
We knew exactly when the box would come in, and we were there when they opened the box.
Third week of the month.
Yeah. That issue where he's left the sewer looking up. We know. Yeah. Oh, that was just, we couldn't believe how we had to wait so long to the next issue.
And honestly, I will say that like since the book went into its final stages, like my favorite thing has been the X books of the last 2 years, like the Hickman stuff, the post House and Powers things. Like I read those every week soon as they come out.
I read this week's Inferno. Just
oh my god, right?
Well, the thing with Hickman to me, it's too clever for me. I have to reread. Like I have to reread people like you telling me what everything meant in every little detail. Like Rich Johnson was on a few episodes back. His stuff, Bleeding Cool, telling me how many times Hickman is this great mirror rhyming writer where he rhymes so much of the stuff he's written in another issue, and his callbacks are amazing. Your chapter on I was going to ask if you had like an Avengers chapter, but your Hickman Avengers chapter is the Avengers chapter pretty much, and have your description of his Avengers run and just how he's. The allure of something that's planned and improvised, Hickman being someone that has the overarching document that seems so mathematically and meticulously devised, and the references, like it is. I wish I was a smarter reader sometimes with him.
Yeah, this is the great thing about your book, Douglas, is that this is why so many Marvel like me who have just kind of diminished out a little bit as a Marvel reader. If I hear something or hear a good buzz or a good artist or something, I'll go check it out. But I'm not the monthly rabid fan, probably since Secret Wars 2. I think that's what killed me.
I make fun of him. He's only read the first 2 issues of Infinity Gauntlet after George Perez read.
Yeah, that's fair.
But
you got the good part. You got the snap here.
But when I read your chapter, the Hickman, the Secret Wars, and I had picked up the hardback collection at a discount place. You know, it's like, oh, I should get this or something. But I mean, I'm like, Secret Wars, you know. But I was sitting in the house, and all of a sudden I read your chapter, like, oh my God. And I pulled it out, and I'm, diving back into it and really paying attention this time. And that's what I think was so great about your book. You get these little snapshots to help us. So I got to the Black Panther chapter. And I think that very day or the next day, I ran out to the comic book store that has a good stock and got the volume 1 of the Christopher Priest run, because I knew it was out at the time. I saw it, I looked at it, browsed through it, but I never bought it. And then I go, oh my gosh, the way you wrote about that and the way you focused on Black Panther, and I was just like, I gotta get this one now. Because
what did you think of it? Is my question.
Oh no, so far I haven't finished it, but no, it holds up. I had come in on the Hudlin series that got my attention more, but somehow the Christopher Priest I just didn't. I get maybe it was the artwork at the time or something.
Extra, right?
Yeah, he's hot and cold with me sometimes, but I just couldn't believe how you articulated that series and how the excitement and the buzz on that is.
One of the things you mentioned earlier in the book that I think is pretty. One of the reasons I like you as a writer a lot, and why I think certain things that are great about this book, is that you mentioned you're more of a pop art critic. You mentioned the music earlier, and that if something's a popular art, you write about it, and you write about what its appeals might be. And I mean, lately I've been figuring that one of the reasons I think I don't think all art criticism is dying per se, but I think it's changing in a way where it needs to get more advocacy. Just where in general,
Okay.
because like the criticism comes too much to me from the consumer side of like don't lose your money on buying something that like for a weekend matinee or something like that. Whereas it's just not hard to tear down the suspension of disbelief. It's not really that hard to tear it down, but to point out what is great about it. And I mean, you've aggrandized like all of our Marvel reading and all of our comic reading, the mainstream reading, in such a great way.
And did I forgot, is it reading comics or something? Did you, part of the appeal of comics, especially mainstream comics in a way, because the art comics, they already got the art in quotes. The mainstream comics, I quickly, early on, started following creators than I did characters. And then that led me to the history, and that led me to the journal, Comics Journal, and Comics Reader, and the fanzines, and it opened this. It was a gateway to this all these different aspects, almost overshadowing just the fun of reading Spider-Man fighting a bad guy. It was more so, and like remember you're talking about Sal Buscema. I remember there's the last issue of the original X-Men run is they fight the Hulk in Vegas.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful style, and it's Sam Granger inking them, and you get a good inker on Sal, and man, he just flies. If it comes off the page. So I want to get back to that. Do you think there's still that stigma? I mean, I grew up under the stigma that I had to hide the comics. I wasn't cool. You could collect baseball cards and do sports statistics, and you're still okay. If you start talking to artists and writers and comic book runs, you were kind of weird. And I had to kind of hide it in the '60s, in the early, and then, even though my friend and I did comic books, we were the artists of our class, and so that we got a kind of a cachet with that. But you think it's comic books are at a point where okay, there's highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow? Is there acceptance of it going on? You think? I mean, to see this book come out, is that?
I would think this book's a big help on this.
Yeah, I mean, what are the responses you're getting
or
from
your
the book?
work in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's like how crazy to spend 6 years on a book about guys in underwear beating each other up, or are you getting good responses, or you think this is going to, turn the tide? Hopefully, help turn the tide, maybe, or is the tide been turned? It might,
I think the tide is well and truly turned. I mean, like I teach a class on this stuff. Like it's not hard to convince people that something is interesting if you can articulate what's interesting about it to you. I think that there's not so much the like, oh no, that's a trash medium. Like, no, that people don't do that now. That's not so much.
Well, a recurring thing with me and Ted, we always talk about our love of high-low, and I think your book distills why Marvel in particular is a good example of that. Where, I mean, one big thing, I'm going to get to this towards when we get to the last chapters, but we've had an argument with one of our local film professors about the MCU, and there's a part of me in the last few years that has been like, especially when you get the low-level Marvel characters on the streets who ostensibly could be just basic beating someone up vigilantes, and you're just like, this is pretty fascist stuff. Why am I into this? And then you get to that last chapter where you talk about the youth and the advocacy, or you make the points that in the appendix where like every character, every villain can switch at any given moment, and Marvel may be like where I got relativistic morality from. Like it's almost like the comics are people who watch the movies have to sell the comics to the people who watch the movies, but to a certain extent, it's not that. A lot of the comics are more sophisticated philosophically than the movies are.
Yeah, I can see that.
Thank you. You're very appreciated.
So, two interesting reactions I've had to, like, not to my book, but to older stuff from friends of mine. One is a friend of mine who is deeply in the comics world. She works at a graphic novel publisher, and she is not a superhero comics person at all. She is passionate about the MCU. Goes to every movie, watches every show. Those comics are not so interesting to her. And she more or less edits comics for a living. But like those comics, like the particular genre comics, just never done it for her. You know what? Fine. The other reaction is when, I think around the time Age of Ultron came out, a friend of mine who was not a comics person at all, but who was enjoying the movies was like, so Hawkeye? Are there any comics about him? Yes, there are. Let me tell you.
I got a best friend that started watching the Hawkeye show and was like, is there any specific run I should be, if I'm going to watch this show, is there something?
For once, there's an answer to that.
Yeah, very true.
Your Thor chapter, you have, it seems to isolate on the Walt Simonson run, but towards the end, Loki, and lately your Loki seems to be a big, it's one of the opening quotes in the book.
Yeah. Like, and Al Ewing is just about my favorite person working in mainstream comics right now.
Did you finish up Immortal Hulk?
Yes, I did.
That's crazy.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. The ending of Immortal Hulk was like, okay, yeah, you stuck the landing. Good going. Yeah. Good going.
And have you read and not to keep further, so you read the issue, the new reboot, was it Ryan Otley's drawing it? I forget who. It just came out 2 weeks ago.
The Donny Cates.
Yeah, Donny Cates.
I have not gotten to read that yet. I'm real curious about it.
One of my big things Marvel has pissed me off over the years is that there is a feeling sometimes where if a run is okay or maybe good but not selling well, I kind of wanted to mention this in our Spider-Man section. Like, there's a way of just, even though they don't reboot, they do a soft reboot. This Hulk, this Hulk actually is like completely continues off of Immortal Hulk, which especially after that ending, you're like, doesn't this end at the end of time? How do you go on from this point? But it's so far it's good. Anyway, that one. Al Ewing is I've been impressed with what I've read of his so far.
Yeah. That Loki stuff, like that Loki Agent of Asgard series, it is nobody's first comic. It is, but also it completely like does all the things I like. Just my kind of thing.
Like, it's more fun, disposable Sandman-ish stuff too, where like it's stories about stories, and the characters know they're in stories about stories, and they're okay with it, and they're gods. So, the one chapter, I'm sorry to say that I was telling Ted before we recorded that I have read everything. Like, most of these chapters, my Marvel stuff is having to go homework, and it was easier when you were a kid. But the one chapter I've read everything on is the Iron Patriot chapter.
Haha, Dark Reign.
Yeah, then and like you kind of you mentioned the ending doesn't fulfill up to everything, but like I do remember. Well, I was a big Secret Invasion fanatic going into it too, but like as a political story, like it's a good like how the politics of Marvel work and how it fluctuates up and down. Like, you have that whole President's interlude chapter too.
It's really interesting to go back and look at Dark Reign now and just go like, A, they knew what they were talking about. B, when you can fictionalize the stuff and have distance from it, it makes for a real exciting story.
When after you started the project full tilt after the Sun and you had read the current stuff, did you go back and go through it chronologically, or were you jumping around just getting it all in?
I never read chronologically at all.
Okay.
Every day was just what I felt like reading that day.
Okay. Because I was wondering how the can you imagine? Because I was there actually when it happened. And you were sort of there, I think, maybe. When Kirby,
I was reading some of it. I was reading Dark Avengers. I was reading Iron Man.
Well, I'm actually going back to when I'm changing the subject actually a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
When Kirby came back to Marvel, And what the shock of the wheel stopping when he came back, and we were like going, oh no, the Captain America run, you had this, or the Black Panther run, and these things were going, the typical Marvel route, and then they just put Jack on it, and it just comes to a halt, and he does his own thing. I wonder how that was, how you reacted to that, or could you see it was a pretty huge schism there.
Oh yeah, I mean that, like, those comics don't look like anything else happening at that time. If you think of like 70s Kirby as almost the same kind of arty weirdo that Steve Gerber was, like that stuff, it's much more interesting. I mean, you can read his 2001 as being like something that is as eccentric and personal in its way as like Omega the Unknown.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I at the time though, when we couldn't stand it. It was just like, because I'm a child of Roy Thomas. Continuity is like with a capital C. But now I go back and look at that stuff, and sometimes I just look at it or read it, and you take it on its own terms and with your own perspective, like you said. I think it actually has its own merits in its very interesting way. So. And we love Jack Kirby. We even love Jack still. He was like the grandfather by then that we all loved. But we had the cool uncles like Stranko and Barry Smith you want to hang out with, more. Yeah. So, because with all these omnibuses and these masterworks and all these things coming out, I've forgotten how almost casual, almost like oh, here's a chapter they're just calling up the Avengers and talking to them in a panel. Or just the random showing up of them crossing over into the other titles. They were doing that all the time. It was just it seems more methodical now, but back then it was just like, no, let's just call up Tony and ask him this question. So I got a problem, and then Avengers 16. I just thought, oh my gosh, a comic writer, Chuck Dixon, who. He was collecting Avengers at that time as a kid. He quit. He tells me he quit Avengers because he couldn't stand the fact that Cap is saddled with 3 bad guys. And what is the Cookie Quartet? What is the deal there? But it's such a galvanizing. And it happened right before I started buying them because I love the fact that Samara turned him down. Samara being the usual dick that he is, and you love him for that. But yeah, I just. Those little interludes were great. I almost wish you just do a full-blown sequel to this book and give us the chapter on Daredevil and all the other chapters and the ones that we haven't seen yet. Because I like to see maybe your take on Kill Raven or even Iron Fist or Luke Cage, or you didn't really go full-blown on Doctor Strange, did you?
I did not. So. The one other thing that I cut that I ended up printing up as a little chapbook on its own that I actually took to sell to people when I went on my California tour last month was, so as I said, I was like grazing through all these. I was just reading whatever I felt like on any given day, and I had a spreadsheet, and I would cross stuff off the spreadsheet, and eventually I realized that there were some areas of the spreadsheet that I had been avoiding, which is how I ended up locking myself into an apartment for 11 days with a case of protein drinks and 30 years of The Punisher. And so, yeah, there's a...
Did you at least like the Garth Ennis run? The Garth Ennis run is so good.
I had actually read the Garth Ennis stuff before. Okay. And, yeah, he's really good. There's something that I instinctively dislike about the character that's real hard to get around.
Was it in a footnote you make the joke about the issue that's all about the gun? It's just a gun issue?
It's a series that's about the guns. There's 10 issues of it. It is literally him describing his weapons for 10 issues. It's by Elliot Brown, who did all the technical drawings for the official handbook of the Marvel Universe and stuff. And it's just him talking about his weapons for 10 issues, except there's a little bit in one issue where he talks about his kayak, because it turns out he likes kayaking too.
This is why it's hard to defend 90s comics, because I don't know, I think you mentioned the Marvel Swimsuit issue at one point too? I remember that being in a grocery store and almost picking that up. Like, 90s comics
there were several
weird,
of those. They published it for a few years running. There's also, I know I didn't get to talk about this, Marvel's annual and quarterly reports to their shareholders were in comics form.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm unfamiliar with.
They were like little adventures with the Avengers or the X-Men, like getting into some sort of situation where they would end up just talking about like all of the licensing plans that Marvel had for that year. They're quite a thing.
I forgot. Did you include what about the Western characters, the Cowboys that were regularly the big three? The big three, which is in the '60s, that lasted through the '60s. Not all those Atlas ones, but did you read those?
Those were outside of my.
Yeah,
I drew the border outside of that. Like when they came to the 20th century, I read those, and I read some of them anyway. I read the Kirby stuff. I read the stuff from 61, 62. I read some of the weird Gary Friedrich stuff. But generally, like if it was not happening in the quote present day, I thought, okay, I don't have to read this.
Yeah, because I think wasn't retroactively. Of course, they lose the license every once in a while. But the Conan, it was in Conan technically. Like the pre-universe on that planet, him and Cull, it all came down, and then the Marvel.
There is, in fact, a footnote on one of the earliest pages of the book, which says, "If you are thinking about bringing up the Serpent Crown, I will give you a nickel not to."
Yeah, okay. I saw that footnote.
Now, Godzilla, yes, did read Godzilla, did read Micronauts, did read Rom, like Shogun Warriors. Like if they are in the 616 and interacting with that world, then of course I read it. Marginal cases I read. There's an issue of Top Dog that was originally supposed to be an issue of Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man. I'm pretty sure. So I read that.
Here's another question. Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos.
That's in the past. Except for number 100, which is the amazing one where all the retired Howling Commandos are having a banquet and Martin Goodman is there. And then somebody shoots Reb Ralston.
Yes.
And then, but then he pulls through, and everybody sings. I'd like to teach the world to sing.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing issue. Yeah.
It's a whole thing.
That's one of my favorite runs because John Severin inked. He totally illustrated 3 issues, and then he inked for a long time, and it's just a beautiful looking book. Even though you got Gary Friedrich writing it. And you get this. It's a World War II story, so it's kind of wacky, wonky in some ways.
I realized hearing you two talking about. I do realize what my first Marvel comic was. I don't remember which issue. It was a He-Man issue. Speaking of this misbegotten licensed issues.
Wow.
It would have been a He-Man or a Transformers issue, which Transformers has that weird, bizarre history of coming from all the Marvel writers too.
And Rob's a good example of what I'm talking about, how I still stay into comic books and it's read characters I really would never get near, but especially a toy tie-in, I'm just but it's also Ditko's drawing it, and everybody
just for the last year or so,
right? Yeah. And everybody wanted the ink Ditko, so all of a sudden you got Craig Russell inking issues. And you got Bob Layton and all these other different. I'm like, I got to get this now. It's incredible to see this happening, even though I would care less about the character.
And there's all those beloved issues of G.I. Joe too.
Well, Pop and that wasn't consistent as much. I think art wise, I don't know, but I think Russ Heath did maybe some. I think, but
one thing isn't the Michael Golden. Didn't he do the silent issue? Is that the G.I. Joe one?
I think the solid issue. What is the solid issue? I thought that was Russ Heath, or was that? I don't know.
It's Larry Hama, and I don't know who else. Yeah,
I thought Michael Golden had done some G.I. Joe stuff that got retroactively beloved, but I didn't read it. So
he did the Nom.
The Nom is a lot.
I'm thinking of the Nom. I'm totally thinking of the Nom. I'm sorry. Yeah, I should have read these issues first. Not 27,000, but. Douglas, my 2 favorite chapters are the last 2 chapters. Going back earlier to the morality issue, I think your chapter, what is good is a thing you do. Yeah. That it is funny. I didn't. You really sold me on Squirrel Girl. I really only read that last issue that you so poignantly describe at the very end of the chapter, but the ethos there is just like an ailment to all the problems I have with some of the some mainstream comics right now, and the crime fight, the anti-crime fighting stance,
Yeah, I that whole Ryan North Squirrel Girl run I love so much. It is so sweet and so funny, and absolutely takes its job of like, we are going to have a superhero in the Marvel universe absolutely seriously, and also doesn't take it seriously at all.
Yep.
Are you reading Jason Aaron's Avengers right now?
I read the first part of it. I am not up to date on it.
Okay, I reread the Squirrel Girl chapter today, and I'm loving it. It's great, but it made me realize that there's a Galactus beat that he steals from Squirrel Girl, and it's like a 1-page aside, but
That's great.
the last chapter is the one where I feel like a lot of the I guess the emotion of the book, like it's a journey of like reading to your son and getting the next generation of comics really brought stuff home, at least for me.
Yeah.
Where's your son at with comic books nowadays?
We still read an issue together every night. Me and my wife and my son. We are.
Your wife's involved with this still too, even after Superior Spider-Man.
Yep. She liked that. She liked that too. We are going through Doctor Doom's entire career because I have my podcast about Doom. You know about this?
No.
So
plug time.
It's been on hiatus for a couple months because of the book, but it will be coming back soon. This is the podcast I've been doing called The Voice of Latveria, which is ostensibly a Cold War era propaganda broadcast from Latvian state radio, shortwave radio, and is more actually me talking to somebody every week about one of Doom's comics appearances in the order he experienced them, which is different from Marvel continuity because he has a time machine. And more genuinely than that, it is me talking to a guest every week about whatever the hell they feel like talking about. So one of my favorite episodes so far, my guest was Alex Ross, not the comics artist Alex Ross, but the classical music historian Alex Ross.
The Rest is Noise is a great book.
Yeah. And he wrote that book, Wagnerism.
Yeah, I'm going to read that.
And so there's an issue of Invaders where a time-traveling Dr. Doom crosses paths with Hitler, who has gone to see a Wagner opera in Berlin during World War II. And I was like, Alex, tell me about the role of Wagner's music in Nazi Germany. And so he just talked about that for 45 minutes, and that's the episode.
I've got a friend who's been trying to sell me on the Warren Ellis Doom 2099, which I've never read. Were the 2099 comics involved with this? I didn't remember them being mentioned.
No, but I read them anyway.
Okay.
The Warren Ellis Doom 2099, like, it is proto Warren Ellis.
Okay.
It is him kind of testing out all the stuff he's going to do later. And he's still in the, like, look how shocking I can be phase.
Okay.
This was the Marilyn Manson going door to door trying to shock people phase.
Onion headline.
But like you can see he's building up to what he's going to become.
Okay.
He's just not there, which is interesting to see. And it's interesting to see the last batch of 2099 comics, which is just, okay, this line is doomed. We're just going to kick everything over.
I never read any of the end of it. I never know what happened.
We're going to kick it. It's not that good.
Okay.
There's like a couple of stories that Kyle Baker did in 2099 Unlimited.
Really?
That are, yeah. And it's like I think Kyle Baker with John Francis Moore.
Okay.
And it's Kyle Baker doing like full on Kyle Baker, which is fantastic to see. The 2099 line is kind of a mess.
I like Peter David a lot. I feel like he's an unsung hero in the 90s, but and I think Spider-Man's going to be getting a little bit of a revival because of that trailer that just came out the other day.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Have you gotten up to or past the Wally Wood Doctor Doom series? Run.
We're a little bit past that. I had Paul Tobin on to talk about that. That was really fun.
Yeah, that's a real interesting little run there. Was Amazing Adventures or Astonishing? One of those anthology books.
Astonishing Tales, yeah.
Astonishing Tales, right.
Yeah. And I actually had Jerry Conway on to talk about like the story that he wrote in there, which is the one where like we find out about Doom fighting the devil every year for his mother's soul.
Oh, yeah, right. Right, the Marvel Superheroes issue.
You know, part of the reason, going back to the Hickman Secret War stuff, part of the reason I had trouble enjoying it was because there was that tension when it was coming out that they were going to finally reboot. And I was kind of pissed at that. And I was such a big Ultimate reader, and it felt like Ultimates, it has very similar to the 2099. Like, there was a point in Ultimates where the reason, if you had to ask me why I loved it, it was because I felt like they were synthesizing the stories in a really good way, in a very tight way. And then it suddenly, Reed Richards is a bad guy, and they started saying, "Oh no, it's because we can do stuff we don't do in the other titles." And I was like, I don't think that's why I read the Ultimates titles at all.
Yeah.
And so that was the tension with Hickman, where I was like, "Ugh, okay, what's happening?"
Of course, we're still waiting, and now you'll have to wait for the book on the new universe from you, Douglas.
You do mention the universe in a footnote, don't you?
I read all that too. I didn't.
Do you
I
like
like DP7. I genuinely like DP7 a bunch.
Do you like the Warren Ellis stuff that he redid?
The New Universal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really does not. That didn't click for me.
Okay.
Well, I think
I'm not going to defend it. I don't have a strong opinion on either which way.
One of the tie-ins to that was, I think, the first thing Kieran Gillen wrote for Marvel.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, no, that it's not good, Ellis.
But I've been like, I dropped out of X-Men like in the mid '80s, but that Grand Design by Ed Piskor.
Oh, it's so good.
I just fell in love with that thing. I just like, I knew hip hop was out. I kind of looked at it, but I didn't pull the trigger on buying it yet. But I
still have unread issues just because I know it's a thing you have to sit down and really,
and
really
I'm just
read.
like, I love the fact that, here's one panel from an issue, 142, and the next panel could be an issue from retroactively fitted into the continuity is issue 38, and how he put it all this mosaic into one giant piece. I'm just like, wow, I love this, and that's I really got me kind of because I amongst my friends, we're all kind of like, the buzz of X-Men's kind of awful. We're not. I know you guys. You're talking about the new X-Men stuff. I haven't read that, so maybe I need to rethink that.
In the X-Men chapter, I know is a long chapter. You didn't mention the Joss Whedon run.
Oh well, I was there for that.
Okay.
No, I mean X-Men has always been up and down post Claremont.
It's
so
mentioned. 2 notes on that. Note number 1 is that I thought that the X-Men Grand Design was fascinating. And one of the things I thought was fascinating about it is what it does with Days of Future Past.
Oh, okay.
Which is that it like moves it to the end, like makes that the climax of the entire thing.
Right.
You also had that note in the X-Men chapter that ever since X-Men has been fighting or recycling Dark Phoenix and Days of Future Past, which goes to our Hickman Inferno stuff too.
Inferno number 3, not a spoiler to say there is a moment in that where just everything falls open and you're like, oh, this is the Days of Future Past plot like we have never seen it before.
But although I had to have it explained to me online to figure out exactly why, which that Hickman is,
like the character in question literally says like, all of my Days of Future Past. like I'm gonna hang a lantern on this in case you didn't notice what we're doing here.
I am a blockhead.
Yeah. The other thought is that the idea of rearranging these things that were improvised month to month, that were just like, what are we gonna do? Because we didn't know 10 pages ago what now is going to look like. Doing what he did in Grand Design and turning it into like, but yeah, what if we thought about it all from the beginning? Mark Russell is doing that right now with Fantastic Four Life Story. And
I've been reading, or I read the Zdarsky Spider-Man Life Story, but I haven't read the Mark Russell one.
I like the Zdarsky one. The Mark Russell one is doing something much more like a Grand Design type thing. The first issue of it actually starts with hybridizing the origin story and this man, this monster. And what Reed sees when he is in this alternate space is a vision of Galactus coming, sometime in the future.
I thought I'd read the first issue. I don't remember this. Wow.
Yeah. Like it. So this is not Fantastic Four Grand Design. This is this is
Life Story.
This is Life Story. Yeah, the Mark Russell one, and like it's really thinking about like, okay, if we were setting up the beginning of Fantastic Four to set up the dramatic conflicts and foreshadow everything that's going to be happening after this, this is what the first issue would look like.
Whenever Secret Wars, the Hickman Secret Wars came out, I was selling it to you guys as like, whenever I would tell people like, oh yeah, they showed Doctor Doom's face for the first time, and then I was like, oh that's, or I'm sure but I mean that was the first time I remember seeing it, and then that last issue felt like it was supposed to be Hickman ending his Fantastic Four run and ending all of Fantastic Four, and mainly ending the Reed Victor relationship, especially at the end when they rhyme the image of Doom's face. Yeah. It was.
What speaking of endings, two things. Another 2 points. I guess you read all those the end stories of all the characters. They're all just one-offs, right?
They are not so much in continuity. Although interestingly, so Leah Williams did a Magic What If story, to which her Doctor Strange the End is a sequel.
Okay.
Because I just got a copy of the. I've had them individually, but I got the hardback of the Daredevil one. Where,
In the Days?
End of Days.
Yeah, that's a great one.
End of Days. And then Alan Davis did a couple of. I think they did one of the FF maybe. But what about?
Oh, real quickly, the Garth Ennis The End is a really good one too.
The Punisher one. Oh my god. Yeah. That's dark.
It's dark.
Very dark. What about Earth X and that the Alex?
You know what? I did not read that.
I'm wondering. I'm thinking. I always thought it'd be nice to see the Marvel comics grow old with me, and so, and I'm thinking that's what Alex was doing with that. I think wasn't it? That's a perception that if the certain at a certain point in the Bronze Age, this is where they all go. Peter Parker gets a belly. The Thing has kids. All this happens. I don't know, but that would be another good topic for you there.
So there's a Fantastic Four annual from 1998 where Ben ends up in like an alternate world where the Fantastic Four have been aging in real time since like 1961.
Oh, okay. I'll have to look it up.
It's a Carl Kiesel thing. Carl Kiesel is like the unacknowledged great Fantastic Four guy.
I can see that.
Like he's never done.
He has a good Daredevil run too, right?
Yeah, like he's never done an extended run of Fantastic Four, but whenever somebody needs to just like come in and take care of a Fantastic Four thing, he does it, and he gets those characters super, super strongly.
We didn't bring up the whole. I had never heard 14 years, the sliding timeline thing.
Oh yeah,
your
No,
analysis of it is great, but I never heard the number 14 as like Marvel Universe.
Was it 13 or 14? I thought.
Ish.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's probably 15 now.
Okay. Because I love the fact now, like, but the one thing that doesn't slide is Cap, right? In some ways.
Or you have. I was just reading today. Flash.
Well, in the MCU, that's what's so crazy about the MCU movies. It's like the gap. When I was a kid, Nick Fury, Reed, and Ben were World War II veterans.
Right. And so the thing that Mark Waid has done now with his History of the Marvel Universe, any reference to either World War II or Vietnam that has to be World War II and Vietnam and has to have been relatively recent is now the war in Sian Kong.
I was reading the appendix. You pointed out that Tony Stark was behind enemy lines in an armed conflict, which was a good way of doing it. But there was also that great part where you describe Flash Thompson going to Vietnam, but then losing his legs in Operation Desert Storm.
Yeah. Or in Iraq much later. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that whole sliding. That's. Yeah, that was hard because I've always been trying to articulate that to people, and it's just very hard to point to what the deal is on that.
I mean, with Captain America, the sliding timeline actually makes it more and more poignant as time goes on. That he was a hero of World War II, and then he was frozen in the ice and came out 13 years ago.
How did speaking of the sliding, how does your what is it? The John Byrne, the Lost Years, the Hidden Years, or
The Hidden Years, yeah.
Well, there's the X-Men one, but there's the other one with
right. I know the one you mean.
Yeah. Does that still work, or is that totally gone, evaporated?
I mean, people don't really talk about it that much.
Right.
The one with the first line or whatever they were called.
Yeah.
But also, there's like, sure, you can. There can be a story about some stuff that happened during that period that there were not a lot of superheroes running around after World War II and before, everything started popping off in, I guess it would now be 2006.
Didn't Chicken do an Avengers secret with the Nick Fury?
Yeah, 1959.
Yeah.
So that's a good series too. Well, speaking of Byrne, like I was completely unaware of all the X-Men stuff he's been doing on his website until I read the book.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Well, didn't he just put out the other day his origin of Wolverine?
Probably. I've not been following what he's been doing with that lately, but I bet,
I just saw an article about it. I didn't know about this until I just hadn't. I mean, I knew he did that Marvel thing in the early aughts, but that was about it.
Like, where's the Son of Satan chapter?
That's a whole thing. I will say, like, in terms of like the characters growing up at the same time and at the same rate as their audience, this is where I once again wave the flag for Judge Dredd.
Okay.
Which has been, like, Judge Dredd has been running since 1977, and the characters have aged in real time for 44 years. So they are all 44 years older now than they were when it started.
And has anybody died in that universe?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They die. They do not come back. Dredd himself is pushing 80 now, and his body is falling apart on him, and that's been a big thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are you 2000 AD reader?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And Dredd writers talk occasionally about, like, okay, he's gonna have to die at some point. What do we do with the strip then? And I think a lot of Dredd writers have their own ideas of, like, okay, here is how we continue the strip after Dredd himself is no longer in it.
Now,
and that's interesting.
What is it about Judge Dredd that grabs your attention as opposed like the Punisher doesn't?
So the Dredd starts out, for its first 5 years, it is a fantasy of political violence with no consequences.
Okay.
And then the consequences start happening, and they never stop. And one writer, John Wagner, has been writing, like, at least 50% of it, like, since the beginning, and has really, really been playing the long game. We see things happen, and then we see their consequences 20 years later. And it's made clear, like, there's kind of a pivot point in the story where you realize, oh my God, this guy is a fascist, and the team that we have been rooting for all along has destroyed democracy. They have destroyed everything about their country, and they believe that they are the only solution, and all they can do is make things worse.
Do you see this in, like, the Alex Garland script or whatever he was proposing to do with the movies?
Yeah. So the Alex Garland movie, I like that movie a lot. And what that movie is like, it is not like the grand sweep of Dredd. It is like, this is his Thursday.
Okay.
This is a typical day for him.
Was there hints at
Alex
it?
Garland's, what?
Was there hints at it or what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, it's a tiny bit, a little bit.
Okay.
What Alex Garland said, like, yeah, if I got to do another Dredd movie, I'd want to do the Chopper story. And the Chopper story is this is a character who's a recurring character for a while, and he is somebody who is So if Dredd is lawful neutral, or lawful evil, Chopper is true neutral. Like, he wants to ride his machine without being hassled by the man. And the end of the classic Chopper story is Chopper being led away in chains while the entire city cheers for him.
I just want to thank you for bringing this back around to being a movie podcast too, just a little bit.
Yeah. Hey, so how would you suggest buying Judge Dredd at this point?
Look, I think Ted's wanting to ask, where do you start?
Well, no, because
okay.
Well, they're doing that complete run right now. Aren't they?
So there's the complete case files. There is a book called America, Judge Dredd America, which is my favorite starting point to recommend. It plays to the strengths of Dredd as a thing that spans decades, and you can see the change in the society that it's about. It is a story from 1990, a story from 1996, and a story from 2006 that are about a terrible thing that happens, what happens 6 years later because of it, and what happens 10 years later because of that. There is a new edition of it that is out that's like Judge Dredd Classics America. You don't want that one. You want the one that the cover is a terrified looking woman with an American flag burning behind her. So that is one super, super solid starting point. If you want the sort of classic early adventures, the volume of the case files that I love is volume 5. And volume, like, it's got Brian Bolland drawing part of it. It's got Ian Gibson drawing part of it. Like, the first half of it is like a bunch of like short, fun, cool looking adventures. And then the second half is a story that went on for half a year, 26 weekly episodes, about a nuclear war between Dredd City and effectively Moscow, where the climax is, our action hero committing genocide. Like, he like personally nukes Moscow.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say that. Basically, I have all the Bolin stuff in my collection, in my library, but I've never followed through as it went along. But now you got me very, very interested.
Are you going to be writing any more?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I mean, it was kind of a fluke that I ended up writing this. Dredd has almost always been, so it's a series that's a brutal satire of American culture and American politics that has almost always been made by and for British people. And IDW has been publishing Dredd stuff on and off for a few years. They had the license, and through a complicated change of circumstances, I got to do this miniseries for them. Which is actually set 5 years before the beginning of the British series.
Do you are we going to have another? If you take a big project, I'll be happy for this gap. But is there going to be another gap between your next book? Do you have any ideas? I mean, no, you just finished.
I just finished this.
Yeah.
So I'm batting around some ideas. The main idea I am batting around, I'm going to keep under my hat for the moment, but
fair enough.
It probably has almost nothing to do with comics. Not quite nothing, but almost nothing.
I mean, I still need to read the James Brown book, so I still have more. I can have that in between the gap, although I think I'll be able to get through that fast.
Getting back to all the Marvels quickly, have you heard from any of the higher ups in Marvel, from publishing or the corporate aspect of them, of your book? Any response or any reaction?
Or the comics written community in general?
I'm curious. Well, you got an interview on the Comics Journal, so that was cool.
I got an interview. I have done interviews for 2 of Marvel's podcasts.
Okay.
So, I know people there know about it. Great. Okay. It was like, this book was not for them.
Right. Well, yeah.
but they know about it. I have not had a 80-ton weight dropped on my house. So, yeah.
Well, just to wind it down, I think the thing I want to thank you most for writing this book is like, it's found a way of making me realize that like comics, maybe everyone. You mentioned in reading comics about how from the beginning, like they knew they can appeal mature because there's a shame in these characters for children, and yet so many of us worry that we may have an Arrested Development for keeping reading these books over and over. But you distill the high-low appeal, and it makes me realize I come back to these books so often to feel like a kid again, but not because I'm trying to retreat to my childhood or anything like that, or some nostalgia. Like there's new ideas coming through this. I always used to compare when I try to sell my friends or comics to my friends why I read the monthly pamphlets. It's like there's so much unbridled and inconsistent creativity month to month, and it's.
Could it be that the fact that we listen to music, old, past, present, we can't listen to future music, but past, we listen to an old song, we put it on, listen to a Beatles album, we look at a painting that we like that's hanging up on our wall by.
But this is, this is new though. It's like you point out why, like, because you.
No. Well, that's what I'm trying to say is that
this continues.
Yeah, and the fact that I go to my reading room, which is mostly comic book stuff in one room I have, and it's like I look at the Kirby stuff in a new light, a new discovery. It's like looking at a painting and finding something new in it. I mean, does that make sense? What I'm trying to say that.
But the painting's not over.
No, the painting's not over, and these comic book stories. I mean, looking at the art. I mean, I may not read the story. In fact, I may just go through it and look at it in different ways, or I may read the story. I don't know.
I think you pointed out why I still keep reading, basically, and I thank you for.
Yeah. I'm sorry for babbling. I'm just trying to.
I am here for it. I am listening and enjoying.
Douglas Wolk, thank you for being on the podcast. All the Marvels, please buy this book. It's so damn good.
It makes a great Christmas gift, which a lot of people are going to get in their stockings this year.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.